The afternoon Marcus Webb called 911 because I had changed the combination on my own pool gate. I was inside my house making dinner, and I did not know about the call until the officer knocked on my front door at 6:47 and introduced himself as Officer Raymond Torres from the Louisville Metro Police Department. I said, "What is this about?" He said, "We received a report of a resident being locked out of a shared amenity at this address." I said, "Shared amenity?" He said the reporting party indicated that a pool at this location was a shared community resource and that the gate combination had been changed without proper notice. I said, "Officer Torres, the pool is in my backyard. It is my pool. It is not a shared amenity." He looked at his notepad. He said the reporting party gave this address and said the pool was shared. I said, "Would you like to come in and see the property deed?" He said that would be helpful. I stepped back and he came inside. Let me explain who Marcus Webb was and why he believed my pool was a shared amenity before I explain how Officer Torres and I spent the next 30 minutes at my kitchen table with the property deed and a cup of coffee. My name is Helen Garrett. I am 52 years old, retired high school chemistry teacher, current homeowner for 9 years on Creekwood Lane in a suburb outside of Louisville, Kentucky. My property is a corner lot with a generous backyard that I had converted into a garden and entertainment space over the 9 years I had lived there, the centerpiece of which was an in-ground pool I had installed 4 years ago at considerable personal expense. The pool had been the best financial decision I had made in a decade. It had also been the source of the most sustained property dispute I had experienced in 9 years of home ownership. Marcus Webb lived in the house directly behind mine, our backyard separated by a fence that was mine, on my property, installed when the pool was built. The fence was a 6-foot privacy fence that ran the full length of my rear property line and which I had installed for the obvious reason that pools and privacy went together, and that I was not interested in my pool being visible from every direction. What I had not anticipated when I installed the fence was that the installation would also enclose what had previously been an informal shared green space between the two properties. I want to explain that green space because it is important to understanding Marcus's position, which was sincerely held even if it was legally wrong. Before my pool and before my fence, the area behind my house and in front of Marcus's house had been an open grass area with no formal boundary between our properties. There was a property line, of course, documented in both our deeds, but it was not marked with any physical structure, and both families had treated the space somewhat informally for years. Marcus's children had kicked a soccer ball back there. My previous tenants had put a fire pit in that general area. It had been the kind of casual shared space that develops between neighbors when there are no structures defining where one property ends and another begins. The pool and fence had ended that informality. I had posted notice in accordance with the HOA's fence installation requirements. I had the fence permitted and inspected. I had installed it on my property line with a survey confirming the placement. Marcus had filed an HOA complaint about the fence within the month. The complaint alleged that the fence had eliminated access to shared community green space without proper process. The HOA board had reviewed the complaint and dismissed it within 6 weeks. My deed showed my property line clearly. The fence was on my side. The green space Marcus was describing as shared had in fact been entirely on my property all along, a fact that the survey made unambiguous. The informal use had been my informal generosity and not any documented shared right. The HOA board's dismissal letter had said exactly that. Marcus had not accepted the dismissal. He had appealed to the full membership, which was his procedural right. The full membership vote had confirmed the board's finding by a margin of 71-3. Marcus had not accepted the membership vote either. He had retained an attorney who sent a letter arguing that informal shared use over a period of years could establish a prescriptive easement. My attorney, Dennis Holt, had responded that the prescriptive easement claim failed on multiple grounds, including the timeline requirement and the absence of hostile use, noting that informal neighborly accommodation was the opposite of hostile use under the relevant standard. Marcus's attorney had not filed a civil complaint. But Marcus had not stopped trying. He had appeared at 2 subsequent HOA board meetings to raise the issue again. He had circulated a letter to neighbors asking for support for his position. He had come to my door 3 times in the 18 months since the fence was built to have conversations that always began reasonably and concluded with Marcus saying that this was not over. I had always been polite. I had always been clear. And I had always documented the conversations. The pool gate was on the fence panel that faced Marcus's property. It had been installed as a maintenance access point, and I had originally used a simple combination lock that I rarely changed because I rarely had reason to. Marcus had apparently discovered the combination. I do not know how. The most likely explanation was observation. The lock was visible from his property, and a determined person watching long enough would eventually see the combination being entered. Alternatively, he might have simply tried common combinations until one worked. However he found it, he had been using my gate. I had discovered this 6 weeks ago when my security camera, which I had installed 2 years prior covering the full fence line, showed Marcus entering through the gate on 4 separate occasions. On 2 of those occasions, he had come alone and walked the perimeter of my backyard without entering the pool area. On 2, he had brought his younger son, who appeared to be about 12, and they had sat on my patio furniture near the pool for approximately 30 minutes each time. He had not used the pool, but he had been in my backyard on my furniture without permission on 4 documented occasions. I had changed the combination. That was the action that had apparently prompted the 911 call. Officer Torres sat at my kitchen table, and I spread the property deed in front of him. I showed him the property line. I showed him the pool location relative to the property line. I pointed to the fence installation permit, which I had retrieved from my files while the coffee was brewing. He looked at all of it carefully. He said, "This is your property and your pool." I said, "Entirely." He said, "The reporting party said it was a shared amenity." I said, "There is no shared amenity here. There is my pool on my property behind my fence." He said, "How did he get your gate combination?" I said, "I do not know. What I know is that my security camera shows him entering through the gate 4 times in the prior 6 weeks. I pulled up the footage on my laptop. He watched all 4 clips. He said he was on your property. I said, "Yes." He said, "Without permission." I said, "Without permission. I changed the combination when I discovered this." He said, "And he called 911 because you changed your own gate combination." I said, "That appears to be what happened." Officer Torres leaned back in his chair. He looked at the deed. He looked at the camera footage. He looked at me. He said, "Ms. Garrett, I need to go speak with the reporting party." I said, "I understand." He said, "For what it is worth, I want you to know that based on what I have seen here, your legal position is clear." I said, "I know." He said, "I am going to document this visit, and I am going to document what you have shown me." I said, "I would appreciate that." He went to Marcus's house. I watched from my front window. He was there for about 20 minutes. When he came back, he did not knock on my door again. He sat in his patrol car for a few minutes, writing what I assumed was his report, and then drove away. I went back to making dinner. Marcus called me at 8:15. I let it go to voicemail. The voicemail said, "Helen, I think we need to talk. The officer told me some things I want to discuss with you. Please call me back." I called Dennis Holt instead. Dennis said he called 911. I said, over my gate combination. Dennis said, Helen. I said, Dennis. He said, what did the officer say? I told him everything Officer Torres had seen and said. Dennis said, the camera footage is significant. I said, 4 documented entries without permission. He said, that is trespass. I said, I know. He said, do you want to pursue it? I said, I want to understand the full situation before I decide. Marcus has been pushing on this for 18 months. The 911 call is the most aggressive thing he has done. I want to know what the officer told him. Dennis said, the officer probably told him that the pool is your property and that he had no legal right to the gate combination or to access your backyard. I said, that would explain the voicemail tone. Dennis said, what was the tone? I said, less aggressive than usual, more like someone who has just had a conversation that reorganized his understanding of the situation. Dennis said, that sounds like a man who was told clearly by a police officer that he had been trespassing. I said, yes. Dennis said, Helen, what do you want? I said, I want it to end. I want Marcus to stop. I want the documentation to support whatever legal action makes that happen most permanently. Dennis said, the camera footage gives you a trespass claim for 4 incidents. Combined with the 18-month pattern of complaints and the 911 call, you have a harassment component. I said, what is the most efficient path? He said, a formal demand letter citing the trespass incidents, putting him on notice that any future access to your property will result in criminal trespass charges, and requesting a written commitment that he will not attempt to access your property again. I said, and if he does not comply? He said, then we pursue the trespass claim and a protective order. I said, send the letter. He said, tomorrow morning. I went back to dinner. The pasta was overcooked, but I ate it anyway because it was Tuesday, and I had a garden club meeting on Wednesday and chemistry to check in the pool on Saturday, and a life to live that did not require Marcus Webb's permission to proceed. That was the end of part 1. The officer had been to Marcus's house. Dennis was sending the demand letter in the morning, and the specific understanding that the camera had been running for 2 years and had caught 4 entries without permission was about to land on Marcus Webb's desk in the form of a letter from a property attorney. Part 2 is where Marcus Webb received the letter and made a decision about what to do next, and where that decision produced a conversation that neither of us had expected. Dennis's letter arrived at Marcus's address on a Thursday. I know because Marcus called me Thursday afternoon. Not with the tone of the Tuesday voicemail, which had been conciliatory in the specific way of a man who had just been told something uncomfortable by a police officer and was recalibrating. This call had a different quality. It was the voice of a man who had read a formal letter from an attorney citing 4 documented camera incidents and the relevant Kentucky trespass statute and the potential consequences of further unauthorized access, and who had sat with that letter for approximately 4 hours before calling. He said, Helen, I received a letter from your attorney. I said, I know. He said, he cited camera footage. I said, yes. He said, you have been recording my entries. I said, I have security cameras on my fence line. They cover my property. You entered my property without permission on 4 documented occasions. The cameras recorded it. He said, I did not think you were home. I said, Marcus, whether I am home or not does not change whether you have permission to be in my backyard. He was quiet for a moment. He said, I want to talk to you, not through attorneys. I said, I am open to a conversation, but I want you to understand that the conversation does not change the legal situation. The demand letter stands and Dennis will be proceeding if there is any further access without permission. He said, I understand that. He said, can I come over? I thought about that. I said, yes, come to the front door. He came 20 minutes later. I let him in and we sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Officer Torres and I had looked at the deed 2 days prior. Marcus was 61 years old. I knew this because we had been neighbors for 9 years and because neighbors know things about each other even when they are not friends. He was a retired civil engineer who had moved to Creekwood Lane with his wife Carol and their 2 boys when his oldest son was 8 and his youngest was 4. Carol had died of cancer 4 years ago, the same year I had the pool installed. I knew that too. He said, the green space. I said, I know what you are going to say. He said when Carol was sick, the boys used to go out back to give her quiet. They would kick the ball back there. Your property, I know it was your property, but you never said anything and it was a place for them. I said, Marcus. He said after she died the older one went to college, but Danny, the younger one, he still goes out there, not to cause trouble, just to be in the space. I said, the 4 camera entries. He said 2 were me, 2 were Danny. I said, the one where you sat on my patio furniture. He said, Danny and I, it was Carol's birthday. I know that does not make it right. I sat with that. I thought about the 2 incidents where he had come alone and walked the perimeter, not sitting, walking, like he was marking something. I said, what were you doing when you came alone? He said, just walking, the back part of your yard where the old fire pit used to be, before the fence. I said, the fire pit area. He said, Carol and I used to sit out there sometimes in the evenings, before it was yours. I said, it was always mine. He said, I know, but we did not know that back then. We just knew it was open space and we used it. I said, Marcus, I am not angry about the past. I am asking you to stop. He said, I know. He said, the HOA complaint, the attorney, the 911 call, I have been making this much harder than it needed to be. I said, yes. He said, the 911 call was stupid. I knew it was stupid when I made it. I was angry that you had changed the combination and I did not think about what I was actually asking them to do. I said, Officer Torres was very clear about the legal situation. He said he told me I had been trespassing. He said it matter-of-factly, not unkindly, just as a fact. I said, it is a fact. He said, I have been treating your property like it was partly mine because it felt partly mine for a long time. I understand that the feeling and the reality were 2 different things. I said they were. He said, Helen, I want to ask you something. I said, go ahead. He said, is there any version of this where Danny can come back sometimes, not without asking, not through a gate I should not have the combination to, actually asking? I said, what would he be asking for? He said to sit in your backyard sometimes. He is 16, he does not want to swim, he just wants to sit in the space where he used to go when things were hard. I sat with that for a long time. I thought about 16-year-old Danny Webb, who had been 4 years old when his family started using the green space behind their house, who had been 12 when his mother died, who came to sit in my backyard on his mother's birthday because that was where he and his father had gone. I thought about what I was protecting and what I would be giving away if I said yes, and whether those were the same thing or different things. I said, if Danny wants to sit in my backyard, he knocks on my front door and asks. If I am home and it is a reasonable time, I will say yes. If I am not home or it is not a good time, he comes back another day. Marcus said, that is more than fair. I said, it is what I can offer. It is not a right. It is not an easement. It is a neighborly accommodation that can be withdrawn at any time. He said, I understand. I said, and Marcus? He said, yes. I said, the HOA complaints and the attorney letters and the 911 call, that has to stop. He said, it stopped Tuesday evening when the officer left my house. I said, I need it to stop in a way I can document. He said, what does that mean? I said, I need you to send Dennis a written statement confirming that you have no claim to my property, my pool, or my backyard, and that you will not attempt to access my property without my explicit invitation. He said, you want it in writing. I said, I always want it in writing. He said, that is fair. He left. I called Dennis. Dennis said, he came to your house. I said, we had a conversation. He said, tell me. I told him everything. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Helen, the Danny situation. I said, I know what you are going to say. He said, any accommodation you offer creates a potential argument for established permission over time. I said, I know, that is why I said it is not a right and can be withdrawn, and I want it in the written statement. He said the statement should include language that the accommodation is personal to Daniel Webb, non-transferable, revocable at your discretion, and does not create any legal right of access or any prescriptive easement claim. I said, exactly that language. He said, I will draft the statement. He drafted it that day. Marcus reviewed it with his own attorney, a man named Philip Cross, who called Dennis the following week and said his client was prepared to sign it and was grateful for the accommodation regarding his son. Dennis said he was glad it could be resolved. Philip said the HOA complaint history, the 3 appeals. Dennis said, my client is not pursuing the trespass claim if the statement is signed and the accommodation terms are honored. Philip said the statement will be signed. It was signed the following Thursday. Marcus Webb signed it in the presence of his attorney. I received a copy. I put it in the file with the deed and the survey and the fence permit and the HOA board dismissal and the membership vote and the 3 prior attorney responses and the camera footage and Officer Tor's incident report. The file was now 12 items. It was a good file. Dennis said it was one of the best documented neighborhood dispute resolutions he had seen in 14 years, which I attributed to 30 years of teaching chemistry, a field in which documentation was the difference between a reproducible result and a story you told at a conference that nobody believed. Danny Webb knocked on my front door the following Saturday morning. He was 16 and tall in the way that teenage boys are tall before they have grown into the height, and he had his father's eyes. He said, Ms. Garrett, my dad said I should ask. I said, he told me you might. He said, is it okay if I sit in your backyard for a while? I said, it is a nice morning for it. Come around to the gate. He came around to the gate. I gave him the combination. Then I thought about it for a moment and went to the garden shed and got him a key. Not because he had a right to it. Because he was 16 and had lost his mother at 12, and because sometimes the most important thing you own is the capacity to give something when you do not have to. I told him the key was for him personally and not for anyone else, and that he should knock before he used it when he was not sure I was home. He said, thank you, Ms. Garrett. He went and sat in the backyard near the old fire pit area. I watched him from the kitchen window for a moment while I made a second cup of coffee. He was just sitting. Not swimming, not using anything, just sitting in the space. I went back to my Saturday. The pool chemistry was fine. The gate was locked. The statement was signed. The file was complete. Here is what I will leave you with. Marcus Webb spent 18 months fighting for something he did not have a legal right to, because the feeling of a right and the reality of a right had become the same thing in his mind over years of informal use and loss and grief that had made a stretch of someone else's backyard into something it was not. The law was clear. The documentation was clear. The police officer who came to my house on a Tuesday evening was clear. But the conversation on Thursday was the thing that actually resolved it. Not because I gave Marcus what he wanted, because I understood what he actually needed and found a version of it that was within my rights to offer and his right to accept. The documentation made the legal position clear. The conversation made the human position possible. Both were necessary. Know your property, know your deed, know your fence line, document everything that happens along it and inside it. When someone claims a right they do not have, the documentation is the answer. But also know that sometimes behind the legal argument is a human situation that the legal argument alone cannot fully address. Document first, then have the conversation. In that order. Because the documentation gives you the security to have the conversation without giving anything away that you do not choose to give. And sometimes what you choose to give is worth more than what the law could have taken. Danny Webb sits in my backyard sometimes. He never swims. He just sits. I do not mind at all. Drop your thoughts below. If you have had a neighbor claim rights to your property that they did not have, tell me about it. And if you are in a dispute where the legal position is clear but the human situation is complicated, try to understand both before you decide what to do with the legal position. The file protects you, but the conversation might be what ends it. Start with the file. End with the conversation. End of part 2, approximately 7,000 words. Thumbnail text. He called 911 because I changed my pool gate combination. The officer had thoughts about that.